and I'm delighted to say that we have with us here to answer the question two leading experts on non-proliferation efforts who, I'm happy to say, are both colleagues here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. To my immediate left is Frank Gavin, who is the Director of Studies at the Robert S. Strauss Center and the inaugural Tom Slick Professor of International Affairs at the LBJ School. He is also the Director of the Next Generation Project, U.S. Global Policy and the Future of International Institutions, a multi-year national initiative sponsored by the American Assembly at Columbia University. Earlier this year, Professor Gavin was awarded a senior fellowship by the Nobel Institute in Oslo, Norway. Next May and June, he will join a select group of distinguished scholars from around the world who will participate in the Institute's program on the spread of nuclear weapons, past experiences, and future challenges. It's quite an accomplishment of Frank's in recognition of his contributions to the field. To my right is Professor Alan Cooperman. He's Associate Professor of Public Affairs at the LBJ School and Director of the Strauss Center's Nuclear Proliferation Prevention Endowment. Before beginning his academic career, Alan worked as Legislative Director to Congressman Charles Schumer and as Legislative Assistant to Speaker of the House Tom Foley. Professor Cooperman has carved out an equally distinguished academic career. He is world-renowned for his work on humanitarian intervention and is the author of The Limits of Humanitarian Intervention, Genocide in Rwanda. He is also a prominent voice in nuclear debates, dating back to his early work for the Nuclear Control Institute, a private organization devoted to eliminating the use of plutonium and highly enriched uranium from civilian nuclear power in research plants. So please join me in welcoming Professors Gavin and Cooperman. We're going to begin to talk in a moment, but I would ask people that if you have a BlackBerry or cell phone that's prone to going off and playing the Jonas Brothers or Eminem, if you could silence it or put it on mute, we would all appreciate it. Frank, I'd like to begin with you. You're a historian, and so I'd like to begin with a history question, which is back in March of 1963, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the nation, warned the American people that by the mid-1970s, as many as 25 countries could possess nuclear weapons, and the consequences for American security would be dire. But here we are more than 45 years later. Only 9 countries have nuclear weapons, indeed only 5 more than when Kennedy gave his address. Was the failure of John Kennedy's nightmare scenario to materialize a matter of luck or design?
Great question, and before launching into it, thank you, Jim, for that very kind introduction, and let me say what an honor it is to be on this panel with Alan, who is really one of the world's experts on this question, and also to say what a pleasure it is to see John and Becky and to thank them and to reiterate what Jim said about making these kind of programs important, and to see so many people come out in an early afternoon after lunch to discuss such early questions. I think it was a combination of both, and if the audience was interested, I could tell a little bit of the history of how America's non-proliferation policies developed from Kennedy to Johnson in a way that I think actually did get us to a place where we are now, where there are only 9 and not many more. There used to be an attitude, I would say in the 1950s and 1960s, that there really wasn't anything you could do to stop nuclear proliferation, that this was one of the most important and intimate decisions a state made about their security, about their survival, and the ability to intervene and prevent that was extraordinarily difficult. And a lot of this attitude was shaped by American experiences with France. France had been a close ally. We had fought on their behalf in 2 wars. We're involved in an alliance to defend them. And yet we could do very little to prevent them from acquiring their own atomic weapons. And this caused great bitterness and dissatisfaction in the American government, and it also caused a lot of people to believe that not only was it inevitable, but there was very little that you could do about it. And some very important people, including Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, believed that there really wasn't much that could be done, and in fact, if it was inevitable, there would be times you might want to think about helping allies. There was active consideration of helping India, helping Japan, to actually promote proliferation because it was inevitable. President Johnson, the man who we honor in this building, is probably the single most important person for helping to shift that attitude and to shift the policies that corresponded. And there were a whole series of policy initiatives and decisions that led to the 1968 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And there's a lot of details, and I can go into the story later. But the key point is that President Johnson, at a very early point in his administration, made nuclear nonproliferation and, in general, the idea of reducing the dangers of nuclear war one of his key priorities. And often without the support of much of his administration, and often overruling so-called wise men like John McCloy and Dean Acheson and George Ball, who didn't think it was possible, and was responsible for, at some political cost, pushing through policies, and not just policies, but attitudes that helped, I think, shift the nuclear proliferation landscape and led to the '68 treaty and created the attitude that, yes, in fact, it was possible to slow or even prevent proliferation. And I think that was the most important change between Kennedy in '63 and by the time Johnson left in '68, '69.
Now, I want to give you a chance to answer that question, but also maybe to push the ball a little bit further down the road. To what extent should we worry about proliferation? Because the assumption that, as Frank talked about, was that proliferation would be a bad thing. But as you know, there are some scholars who would argue that nuclear weapons had the benefit of concentrating people's minds wonderfully, and that helped produce the stability of the Cold War. We sort of knew what would happen if we went to war, and we all stepped back from the brink.
I'd be happy to. First, let me also reiterate Frank's thanks to the Brumleys, not only for this event, but for some of the preceding events when we brought Frank von Hippel down here and David Albright, some of the cutting-edge research and policy activism on nuclear nonproliferation, bringing that to the UT campus. And to also reiterate my appreciation for being on the panel with Frank, who is no slouch himself on nuclear nonproliferation policy, and really in a couple ways. First of all, he does something that academics really should do, which is that he questions conventional wisdom, and that's true scholarship. And he also goes back into the history, things that we think we know, and something I tell my students all the time is all these things we think we know, but until you go back and actually do the historical research, you don't actually know them. And it turns out a lot of the time that things we think we know, received wisdom, are not true, and that's one of the things Frank uncovers in his research. Now, to your questions. The first one, do we have fewer nuclear powers today than Kennedy predicted? Is it a matter of luck? Is it a matter of design? I think it's clearly in part the result of nuclear nonproliferation policies that have been adopted and pursued at some cost. And we can go into that later. But what the argument I don't like is when people say, oh, well, Kennedy warned about this 40 years ago, 45 years ago, and it didn't materialize, so it just goes to show it's not really a risk. It ignores the fact, it's, as I tell my students in my methodology class, that's very, very poor methodology. It assumes that this is just sort of a natural effect and doesn't look at the interventions that have been made, very, very serious interventions over the years to keep that number down. So that's the first point. On your second question, should we worry about proliferation? Well, probably the most famous political scientist in international relations in the world was a guy named Ken Waltz. And Ken Waltz says, and said famously in a 1981 article, we shouldn't worry about nuclear proliferation. Not only is it not bad, it's good. Okay? And he had a deductive argument and he had empirical evidence. Deductive argument is that states will be so afraid of nuclear retaliation that they would never actually use these sorts of nuclear weapons. In fact, they wouldn't even start conventional wars because of the fear of escalation to nuclear war. So these things actually, by deductive logic, they should lead to less war. And aha, we also have empirical evidence from the Cold War. U.S., Soviet Union had nuclear weapons for 4 decades, never fought a nuclear war, never even fought a conventional war directly against each other. So deductive logic, empirical evidence. Most famous political scientist in international relations. It's a closed case, right? It's not a closed case, and it's not a closed case for 6 reasons. If you'll bear with me, I'll go through them very, very quickly. The first is that when you get a state that newly acquires nuclear weapons, it does not have good command and control over those nuclear weapons. We didn't, the Soviet Union didn't. No country that acquires nuclear weapons initially has good command and control. So the more countries that get nuclear weapons, the more the risk of unauthorized use. Secondly, if you have nuclear weapons and the other state doesn't, but it starts to acquire them, you have this incentive for preventive war. Or maybe they only have a few nuclear weapons. Now you have, and you don't want them to get dozens, now you have an incentive for a preventive war against a nuclear power. That doesn't sound very stabilizing. Third is that at the beginning of the process, when adversaries have acquired nuclear weapons, there aren't what we call rules of the road. That is, where are the red lines that if you cross it, it's a provocation, and so you know not to cross it. If you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets didn't think that putting nuclear warheads in Cuba was crossing a red line. We absolutely thought it was a red line. That's why we nearly had a nuclear confrontation. So at the beginning, those things don't go well. Fourth is that if you have a bilateral relationship and a nuclear weapon goes off and you're the only 2 countries that have them, you know who did it. But if you have 50 nuclear powers and a nuclear warhead goes off, you don't know necessarily who exploded it, so you don't know who to retaliate against. That means deterrence may not work. Accidental use is also more likely. But the last one, which Waltz really didn't contemplate at all, is the fact that terrorists could acquire nuclear weapons. And Waltz's argument was based on the fact that states want to survive. All of his theories are based on that. States want to survive, and so therefore they won't do things that potentially would engender retaliation and destruction and annihilation against themselves. But terrorists don't necessarily have a return address. That means that the threat of retaliation may not be credible and may not be sufficient to deter them. So for all those reasons, the deductive logic in Waltz is not correct, even though so far he's right. We haven't seen nuclear weapons used in anger since 1945.
Frank, really 2 questions. One, are you sort of pro-Ken Waltz in this issue, anti-Ken Waltz in this issue? And second, as you know as a historian, political scientists are often running around talking about how there's been a major break in international relations. Everything is new and everything has changed. Have nuclear dangers changed since the end of the Cold War, when you had the Russians and the Soviets and the U.S. in the bottle like 2 scorpions?
I would say that Ken Waltz's depiction of the Cold War and the role of nuclear weapons is vastly oversimplified. And I think Alan's captured some of the issues and problems with it. I think the main one in my own historical research, when I look, nuclear weapons are very complex, and they create a lot of paradoxes in international behavior. Some of the forces pull towards stabilization, others push towards instability. And it's very hard to look at any number of crises during the Cold War and argue that nuclear weapons stabilized them. If you were to define stability as the absence of a major crisis leading to a war, then there were many times that nuclear weapons made things more dangerous than they had to be. So I share some of Alan's concerns. I also, it's a very overly simplistic view of a very complex period. And so, no, in general, I don't. But sort of in response to what you asked, 2 things have struck me as a historian. One, I feel as if we asked the wrong question. The question is proliferation bad? And to my mind, the question is, what can we do to prevent nuclear use. Now, they may be related, they may not, but if at the end of the day, who possesses them is somewhat different from whether or not they'll be used, I'm going to be more concerned with the latter question. And the reason I bring that up is that it's not always entirely clear to me that possession increases the likelihood of use. In some cases it does, in some cases it might not. It depends on who has them, perhaps. It depends on how they might be used. But it always just strikes me that this debate is a little bit skewed, because what I care about is making sure that they're never used. And the second point I would make as a historian is they've only been used twice, and they've been used by us, and they haven't been used since. And to me, that opens up a whole lot of really interesting questions. And I'm also struck when I look at what a lot of people say on these questions, and they speak with a lot of certainty. And what strikes me as a historian is how little we know. There is no empirical record. There's very little empirical record other than those two uses of August 1945. So as I kind of struggle and wrestle and try to figure these things out, I don't see a lot in the historical record that can help me. This is really tough. You really have to get into the nitty-gritty of how these weapons affect actual decision-making during crises. And so I am always cautious and suspicious of rather glib statements. For example, Graham Allison could very well be right. But when I was doing a little bit of historical research, Graham Allison made that same statement in 1991. And that was a little while ago. And then he made the same statement again in 2002. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about nuclear terrorism. But what it means is, I think, as scholars, we should be a little more careful about the assertions we make and the certainty we express about an issue in which the consequences are enormously grave, but the historical record doesn't provide us a whole lot to go on. And that's why I think it's an important but also a challenging set of questions.
Alan, would you accept the distinction Frank has offered between is proliferation bad and what can we do to prevent their use?
Well, I think it's a fair way to look at it. I tend to, because I think that there are generic risks to nuclear proliferation, those that I outlined in my last answer, I think that all things being equal, it's not good for us to have nuclear proliferation. Now, Frank's absolutely right that some nuclear proliferation is going to be more of a threat to us or a risk to us than other. But the way that I look at it, which is will not have a different conclusion than Frank, but the way I tend to look at it is our nonproliferation efforts worth the cost? And make no mistake, there are costs to nonproliferation. Sometimes we go to war over our nonproliferation goals. Sometimes we lose allies over our nonproliferation goals. Sometimes we lose trade and commerce over our nonproliferation policy. And so there are real costs. And so, as with any foreign policy, you have to weigh the benefits versus the costs. And sometimes, I would argue, nonproliferation or counterproliferation, that is trying to reverse or use military force to stop, sometimes it is not worth it. Okay, if we think about the fact that there was thought given to preventive strikes against the Soviet Union or against China to stop their nuclear program, I would argue that we made the right decision, that the goal of nonproliferation in those two cases was not worth the potential cost of going to war. So those, for me, were no. And then there are some cases where it seems to me it's clearly yes, that the benefits outweigh the costs. One of the issues I've worked on for 20 years is this effort to remove bomb-grade uranium from civilian facilities, where it's used as fuel in research reactors and it's used to produce medical isotopes. And the fact is, you can do both of these activities with uranium that is not usable in nuclear weapons. Moreover, bomb-grade uranium is the easiest way to make a nuclear weapon. So the benefits of nonproliferation are great. The costs are not very high. So it's sort of a no-brainer for me, yes, in that case. And then there's the gray ones. Okay, so we can think of Iraq in 2003. And here was another case where I thought that the Bush administration was pursuing its plan for a war on the grounds of nonproliferation, and I thought that this was not worth it. I went back and looked. I wrote 5 op-eds from 98 to 2002 arguing it was not worth it because the costs of war in Iraq would outweigh the benefits to us, and the costs would outweigh it because there would be ethnic civil war, there would be instability in a region with oil, and there could be empowerment of Iran and bringing in of other neighbors. A couple of those things actually happened. And on the other hand, I thought that Saddam Hussein was the kind of guy that actually, if he acquired nuclear weapons, could be deterred. I believed he was rational. So I didn't want him to acquire nuclear weapons. I thought everything peacefully should be done to prevent that. But if it was war or having him acquire nuclear weapons, for me, it was not worth it to go to war. And I'll stop there, but I'll say maybe we'll come back to it. I feel differently about Iran.
Okay, well, I want to go to Iran right now. And let me take this issue of drawing a distinction between whether or not proliferation is good or bad versus the question of if they acquire them, how do you prevent their use? And I think the very real question of a cost issue, that is, can you get the outcome you want at an acceptable cost? And let's take the issue of Iran, because right now the Iranians are pursuing what by all accounts is an attempt to have a complete nuclear fuel cycle, have the ability to produce their own weapons-grade material. There is an effort internationally to dissuade the Iranians from doing so. There's some disagreement in the international, intelligence community as to whether or not Iran is continuing to work on a weapon per se or on a warhead per se. But as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the long pole in the tent is really getting the fuel, weapons-grade material, as opposed to the design of a warhead. So how should we think about dealing with Iran, Frank? Is this a case where you would say, because I would imagine one issue would be if they get it, we won't be able to stop them from using it. So it's best to stop them from getting it in the first place. And how do we think about the issue and the questions you've raised?
Right. I think what Alan said is exactly right. I think this needs to be really pressed home because it's so rare in the debate today that pursuing a particular policy has costs and trade-offs. And nuclear proliferation, everyone, for the most part, there's about probably 5 people who really agree with Ken Waltz. I think most people would prefer less nuclear weapons in the world and more security over nuclear materials. For my somewhat swiping comments at Graham Allison, we are all in his debt for the work that he did at Harvard and his colleagues did on helping Nunn Lugar get through. And I think Alan's absolutely right that any of the low-cost policies and efforts, at least where the cost is only money, or the cost is sort of simple diplomacy, then I think it's obvious we should pursue it because, and I think Alan's absolutely right. And then the debate comes over the level of costs. And I just want to highlight here before talking about Iran that Alan emphasized a very important cost, and that's the use of military intervention. But there's other costs as well. And this comes up time and time again, and I just sort of want to mention one quickly before talking about Iran, and that is because it pertains to how the Johnson administration thought of this. And one of the reasons the U.S. nonproliferation policy was successful was because it decided to make military commitments to other countries to protect them in order to prevent them from acquiring their own nuclear weapons. And this was a key factor in the U.S. relationship with Germany and with Japan. In the case of India in the mid-'60s, they struggled with this, and they recognized it was a trade-off, and they decided that they couldn't do it for any number of reasons. And many of the most perplexing challenges, at least in the record, don't come from the adversaries. It comes from the allies, the Taiwans, the Indias, the Germanys, the Japans, the South Koreas. That being said, in the case of Iran, Alan is. I would be very interested in hearing what his argument is why this would pass the threshold for cost. When I look at Iran, one of the arguments I have heard, and I'd like to hear more about it is pertaining to what Alan said about command and control. There's some uncertainty about Iran's command and control in the same way that people are concerned about Pakistan. And that would be something I would want to hear more about. It certainly would be a worry. My own thinking on this, perhaps being a little less inclined to think about authorizing force, is to look at the case of how the Johnson administration handled the People's Republic of China when they went nuclear in 1964, and to think about the command and control issues that are problems that plagued China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. Now, when I say this isn't an argument for hoping that states with sort of chaotic situations and roguish characteristics we should look the other way. I think we should do everything we can to prevent them short of the use of force. But with Iran, I am not any more persuaded than I was in the case of Iraq that, especially given how hard counterproliferation is, how difficult it is to pull off, that this would be that this would make sense. I think it strikes me that Iran's ability to respond is probably greater than Iraq's. I don't necessarily see the argument why Iran wouldn't behave like other states, essentially use these things for deterrent purposes. Again, the historical record is scant on this. The deductive logic of an Iran giving it to a terrorist group, one of the things that always strikes me about rogue states is they like control. They don't like giving away things, and they certainly don't like decisions out of their hands, and the idea of an atomic weapon being given to Hamas or Hezbollah or another group, which some have argued, seems to me hard for me to imagine. But I could be wrong about this, so I'd be very interested in hearing Alan's case for more active counterproliferation methods.
Before you do that, Alan, can I just get terminological clarification, difference between non-proliferation and counterproliferation, as you understand?
You want to do it, or you want to? I mean, generally speaking, we talk about non-proliferation as things like diplomacy and export controls, things that would prevent people from acquiring nuclear capability. Counterproliferation generally is used to mean after they've acquired some sort of capability, doing something about it. And so non-proliferation is most often going to be non-military. Counterproliferation will very often involve military force. So Iran. As mentioned, one of the costs of their acquiring nuclear weapons would just be the generic ones. I think the command and control one is especially a concern in Iran because there are so many different power centers, some in the government, some not in the government, foundations, in veterans organizations, which are extraordinarily powerful over there. That's the first thing. But there is this first question, which is there something about Iran's leaders that's so irrational that they can't be deterred? Okay, so are they more irrational than Stalin? Are they more irrational than Mao? And the answer is probably not. On the other hand, there is something about revolutionary religious states that seems to can entail very large risk-taking and very high cost acceptance. So if we think about the Taliban, why didn't the Taliban just turn over bin Laden to us? I mean, that seems to me, if I were that would be a no-brainer for me. There was, the old Hebrew National commercials used to say, we answer to a higher authority. And I felt like, the Taliban is answering to a higher authority where ordinary deterrence, coercion, compellence just doesn't apply to them. And that's possible in Iran as well. And as you mentioned, they do give or sell or provide a lot of weapons to folks we don't like, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's these special groups in Iraq. So, some folks agree with you. There was a famous op-ed in the New York Times by Barry Posen, the former advisor of mine, a professor at MIT, very distinguished, and he says, don't worry about Iran getting nukes for 4 reasons. We can count on 4 things. Number 1, Iran is rational. Number 2, Iran knows that if a nuke went off anywhere, we could trace the nuclear material back to Iran. Number 3, if we traced it back to Iran, Iran knows that we would retaliate by annihilating the Iranian regime. And 4, Iran has good enough command and control that there wouldn't be accidental or inadvertent use of nukes. Now, if all 4 of these things were true, and I really believe them 100%, then I wouldn't worry about Iran. But if any of those is wrong, then there's a real concern about Iran getting nukes. And I think that I have questions about several of those, not just one. The tracing material back to Iran thing, this is what they call nuclear forensics. Even American officials agree we can't do that today. So if they're agreeing in open sources we can't do that today, why should Iran be scared that we could trace it back to them? So I do think there's a cost to Iran getting nukes. And then the question is, can we do anything about it with military force? And what would be the cost benefit of that? Military strikes, we had David Albright here over the past year, and he said you can't destroy everything in Iran in its nuclear program. I mean, absolutely you can't. But what you could do is destroy some things, degrade things. You certainly would push back the day when they would actually have enough for 1 or more nuclear weapons. The New York Times story today was a very bad headline. They have enough low-enriched uranium to enrich eventually to make high-enriched uranium for a bomb. So it was a very misleading headline. They're not there yet. So what are the costs if we were to use military force against Iran? And I had a letter in the Washington Post, again, sometime about a year ago, and my argument was that we are exaggerating. The public debate is exaggerating the likely costs. And no one can know what the actual costs would be. But I think we're exaggerating the costs. And people are saying, look what happened when we went into Iraq. And we certainly don't want to repeat that. Well, I don't want to repeat that. I didn't want to do it in Iraq. But what we would do to Iran if we were smart, this is assuming diplomacy doesn't work and they are going gung-ho to continue enriching uranium. What we would do, in my opinion, that if we were smart, would be to first threaten, and then if it didn't work, to actually carry out a surgical strike on their nuclear facilities. Not a wholesale strike, but a surgical strike, and then say to them very, very clearly, we could do it quietly or we could do it loudly. Probably quietly would be better. Say, this is just a taste, okay? And if you mess with us, then you're going to reap holy hell. And I think they would probably understand that. It probably would work. I cannot guarantee that it would work. But are there ways that they could hurt us in retaliation? Sure. But a lot of them they're doing already. I mean, they're arming elements in Iraq that are killing American soldiers. That's, pretty much what else can they do besides, sure, they could do a terrorist attack somewhere on American civilians. But is it worth it to them if it means we would destroy their regime? So I do think that no one can know what the costs of counterproliferation against Iran would be. And you'd be foolish to say, I guarantee you that this would be low cost. But I think the likelihood is that we could degrade their program. The cost to us would not be terribly large. And the hope would be we would delay it long enough that we would get a regime in Iran, some sort of regime change that would either not want nuclear weapons, or we wouldn't worry so much if they got nuclear weapons.
You've both raised, we've spent a lot of time talking about states, but you both raised the issue of terrorists getting nuclear weapons, and that in many ways is the great fear because of the difficulty of tracing it back to its source. How severe is the terrorist threat in your sense, Frank? Is this something new? How should we think about it in the context of the questions you raised so far?
Well, I certainly think it produces a whole series of even more complex questions and puzzles. And there's a whole series of questions you have to think about. One, on the kind of practical side, can they make one? Probably not. Can they produce the materials? Once they produce the materials, can they put them together? Can they deliver it and successfully detonate it? So there's a whole series of questions there, and there's a lot of really good technical expertise on that Alan knows far better than I. But it strikes me that there's an ongoing debate about these important questions. And your colleague, I think Michael Levy, has written a really good, at least to my mind, a very good book on these things, and which suggests, and then if they do it, are there countermeasures that we can do at relatively low cost that mitigate the damage or make it far less severe? I would just say as an aside, one of the things I've been struck thinking about this question is that, and again, none of us can know with any certainty what probabilities are because terrorists have never used nuclear weapons. But it seems to me, if I were to guess, that they would be more likely not to be used against us, but more likely to be used in Moscow, New Delhi, Amman. And to me, one of the interesting questions is, what would we do if that happened? What would we do if the Chechens used a bomb in Moscow? And I don't know the answer to this, and I don't know if anyone's done any good work on it, but it strikes me that for any number of reasons, there's probably a higher likelihood of facing that. And how would we respond? What would we do? On the tracing question, John knows knows more about than just about anybody. One thing that I've been fooling around with in my head, a strategy to deal with this in terms of Iran, and it may just be completely nonsensical, but one of the clever things the Eisenhower administration did during the early 1950s when they were trying to devise a nuclear strategy, they came up with a strategy called massive retaliation, which everyone thought was silly and simple-minded because it said, we reserve the right to treat the communist world as a monolith and respond anywhere we want, anyhow we want to any provocation. In point of fact, their thinking was that they recognized that the Russians were rather conservative in their policies, but that the Chinese were kind of the rogue actors here, especially in the Taiwan Straits, and they used to send signals to the Russians that, look, if China does something we don't like, we're going to blow up Moscow. And this freaked the Russians out, and the Russians went out of their way to put a lot of pressure on the Chinese to behave, which caused a lot of tension and caused a split. I've often thought, I think Alan's diagnosis of Iran's relationship with non-state actors is correct, and I think one of the things I thought that could be a clever strategy is to go to Iran and say, you want nuclear weapons, and you also are in bed with these bad guys, and we're just going to have a policy that if any nuclear explosion goes off that we can't trace and identify, we're just going to blame you, and we're going to hit you. And therefore, the responsibility is upon you to police this. And it would be interesting to see how people in Iran would respond to that, if that would sort of make them tighten up their relationships with Hamas and Hezbollah and others, to let them sort of do the work for them. Because I do agree that Iran can't have it both ways. If they decide, if at the end of the day they have nuclear weapons, then we have to tell them that if something happens, even if it's not near your ken, because you behaved irresponsibly, we are going to hold you responsible until you end up changing your behavior.
Dealing with terrorists?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and I'm sure this is something that will be discussed in further detail on the next panel, where we look at where the panelists will be looking at the connection between the nuclear power industry and potential either national threats or sub-state threats. But I do think it's important to emphasize that the real hurdle to making a nuclear weapon is acquiring the fissile material. That's either the highly enriched uranium or the separated plutonium. Once you have that, you can make some kind of a weapon if you have enough of this material. If you have highly enriched uranium, there's a very, very high likelihood that you can make a nuclear weapon that would have an explosive yield on the order of something like Hiroshima, August 1945. That's quite enormous. If you have plutonium, you're probably going to get a lower yield as a terrorist, because you can't design a weapon that will, it's technical, but that will go supercritical without a pre-initiation with a neutron. So you're going to get something less. Maybe you're going to get only 1 kiloton, not 10 kilotons. But it's still going to be a very bad day for whatever city that nuclear weapon goes off of. And then there's the question, well, would terrorists, if they could do this, would they want to do it? And they're telling us they want to do it, so maybe they're lying. But in their internal documents and in their external documents, they're saying they want to do this. So you have a demand, and unfortunately, given the way that we currently conduct nuclear commerce, civilian nuclear commerce, there may be a supply. And as we teach our students in economics, you got demand, you got a supply, and those two are going to meet. What we're trying to do is prevent that. We're trying to cause a market failure and prevent that. But I think that Frank is right that the claims that are made or the warnings that are made about nuclear terrorism sometimes are exaggerated. If someone tells me there's going to be a 50% chance of this happening in the next 10 years, first of all, they have no idea. So that's, I have no idea where that number could come from. Second of all, it strikes me as too high. I think the probability is much lower than that. But it still worries me, and it still seems to me that preventing even a small probability is worth a considerable amount of effort, given the consequences. Think about the consequences of 9/11, where tragically a few thousand people were killed. Imagine if there were 10 times or 100 times as many people. Imagine what that would do to the global economy, to the way we might overreact to it. Because, as Frank, I think, would agree, one of the big problems with terrorism is that we overreact to it a lot of the times. Well, if we overreacted to 9/11, imagine how we'd overreact to a nuclear 9/11. So they want it, they could do it, and we need to stop them from being able to do it.
Well, at this point, I'd like to bring the audience into the conversation. If anyone likes to ask a question, we have a mic over there, or you can just shout it out loud enough so that our webcast can pick it up. Yes, ma'am.
How can we morally pursue our policy of non-proliferation when we keep all our nuclear weapons?
Who wants to go first?
You want to give it a shot? No.
It's the moral question. Are nuclear weapons immoral? I've never said they're immoral. So, I don't think that's the issue for me. The issue for me when I'm talking about U.S. national security policy, or if I'm talking about promoting international security, is how do we get from where we are today to making sure we don't worsen the situation down the road, and hopefully we make the situation more secure. I personally think that if we got rid of all of our nuclear weapons unilaterally, we would not make ourselves more secure or the world more secure. I also think that it is possible, though not easy, to pursue a non-proliferation policy even though you maintain nuclear weapons. It probably would be a good idea, at the very least, to reduce the size of our nuclear stockpile considerably. Since we have massive overkill, we don't need this many nuclear weapons. It suggests to other countries that not only do they need some nuclear weapons, but they need a lot of nuclear weapons because, well, the United States has been in this business for so long and they've decided they need thousands of warheads, so we must need them too. So the one thing I think we probably agree on is we should at least reduce the size of our nuclear stockpile. I think it would give us minimal but some leverage in negotiations with others, but I think at the very least it would tell other countries that get nuclear weapons that you don't need to go crazy like the U.S. and Soviet Union did. There was no reason for it at the time, and we need to walk that back. Well, I will. Now, the Israel front, I think Frank probably knows the history of that. My guess is better than I do, and probably. Well, we'll see. But I mean, it's
at the end.
Yeah, we'll have a quiz at the end. No, I mean he really gets into the nitty-gritty of the diplomatic exchanges on those things at the time, and so I'll see if let me defer to him on that question. Are we more willing to use nuclear weapons now than we have? Well, I think there were some folks in this Bush administration who started to have an almost Eisenhower-like view of nuclear weapons, that they're just big conventional weapons. And so if you want to do some sort of counter-proliferation strike or something like that, and your conventional bomb can't go deep enough to take out the facility, well, just use a nuclear warhead. So I think there was something like that. My guess is that's reversed under the current Secretary of Defense, although, administrative policy, like battleships don't turn on a dime. There is some inertia. Iran is going the highly enriched uranium route, and what does that mean? Well, I mean, Pakistan did the same thing, and what it meant was that their first nuclear weapon is going to work out of very, very high probability. Unlike North Korea, which went the plutonium route, and its first nuclear weapon, it's only one it's detonated, seems not to have worked very well. So what it means is that we shouldn't think that Iran's going to develop weapons that won't work. If they get the weapons, they're very likely going to work, and that's a concern. But let me turn to Frank.
Yeah, I'll just take on the Israel question and just throw out there this theory that I've had that it's one of these great tragic what ifs, and that is if instead of pushing for a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, we had pushed instead for a comprehensive test ban treaty early on. I actually think there's a very good chance for a variety of political reasons that both Israel and India would have signed. And you would have, if you had done that first and then gone to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, you definitely would have kept India out of the game because they were on the record as being supporters of it. And I think the pressure on Israel would have been tough. And the reason we didn't push a comprehensive test ban treaty was largely, and again, another second tragedy, was largely because the U.S. military didn't want to sign it because they wanted to test anti-ballistic missile devices that wouldn't have been allowed under the comprehensive test ban treaty. I mean, the Israel case strikes me again and again of just bad timing. The U.S. came down very hard in the Kennedy administration on Israel. Then the issue kind of disappeared for a while, and it was one of these. By the time we got our act together to really come up with a policy, it was too late. And then the Nixon administration comes in, and the Nixon administration doesn't care about nuclear proliferation at all. Even though they get the sort of benefit of the treaty being, of signing the treaty, and they make it clear to Israel there'll be no cost. But the Kennedy, particularly the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, did try to do something. The Israelis ended up eluding a lot of this pressure, and waiting out the clock till Nixon showed up. And when Nixon showed up, there wasn't going to be any reversal of it.
Okay, time for one last question. Sir.
If I could just follow up on that, India would likely not have signed because of the Sino-Indian War of '62. They wanted to have some reserve against China. So no amount of talking to India would have made them sign a test ban treaty. Secondly, India and Pakistan fought a small war after both had tested nuclear weapons. I talked about the Cargill episode that Musharraf provoked. So it's possible for nuclear-armed adversaries to fight. But let me turn back to the question.
Let me just, I think you're wrong on the first. The Indian government, and if you look at the internal documents, there were lots of people who had been pressing for a nuclear program since the inception of the state. And even after '62, there were those who pushed against it. The Indian decision, which has been detailed by a great book by George Perkovich and by others, by '62, the decision still has not been fully and finally made. And part of our response to the '62 crisis, the American sort of alliance with India, and Nontheive could tell us far more about this than anyone in the room, had to do, it was, again, you talk about costs, it was a non-proliferation move. We went in and told India, we will make sure that you're protected, because we understood if we didn't protect them that the incentives for getting nuclear weapons would be great. And after that, there was still time in India's case to prevent them from going nuclear. The documentary record's clear on this.
I'm just talking about their motivation.
No, the motivation was there from the beginning, and that's why the India story is particularly tragic.
Coming to Iran and trying to stop their progress by bombing their facilities. The real problem is that they're putting their facilities deep in the mountains, and we don't have a way of effectively destroying them. We can damage them and delay their use, but we're not going to be able to destroy those facilities because we don't have the deep earth penetrators that are going to be effective against them. But what is likely to be the outcome of such an attack, as you describe it, surgical, although obviously you've never seen a surgical operation, but the term surgical is used to mean very precise. That's not what surgery is. But anyway, with a precise and very limited strike against Iran, that would be used by the regime to rally the people to support the regime and say, look, America's attacking us, and that may be contrary to our interests, which may be better served by trying to provoke an internal uprising to overthrow the regime, install a regime that would be at least less militantly against us.
Well, I mean, just very briefly on Iran, there's no question that deeply buried facilities, especially facilities that are built into mountains, are impossible for us to destroy from the air. That being said, the two major nuclear facilities, or three major nuclear facilities in Iran, are not deeply buried. We have the nuclear reactor they're building, we have the enrichment facility, we have the conversion facility. So they may have duplicates of these. They may be able, if they don't have duplicates, they certainly have the technology and they could replicate them at some point. But we could take out certainly most of what we know about, and my guess is that we know about most of what exists. And so no one is saying they're going to be destroyed totally, or that it would prevent them from rallying and rebuilding at some point, but I think it's assured that we would delay. And then the question is delay good enough? And there I would point to the historical precedent of the 1981 strike by Israel on the Osirak reactor in Iraq. Did it stop the Iraqi regime, Saddam Hussein regime, from wanting nuclear weapons? No. But it delayed him, and it delayed him long enough that then we had the 1991 war, and we destroyed some more of the nuclear. And then by that point, he said, hey, twice I got clobbered, and I'm not going to do it again. Unfortunately, we didn't realize that. But, there is at least this, one case, two attempts at two counterproliferation efforts that actually did work through delay and degradation of a program. So, you're right. We can't guarantee it will work, but I think I'm right that it would buy us some time.
Alan, can I say just one clarification on that, because you're talking about strikes. You specifically said strikes from the air. I'm not familiar with the layout of these facilities, but how hard would it to do it from a commando-style attack, or have I just watched too many Chuck Norris Delta Force movies?
I mean, my understanding is that these ones we could do from the air, and there are probably some hidden facilities where you couldn't do it from the air. And what do you do about those sorts of facilities? One thing would be to have a raid and have people run inside the mountain. I'm not a big fan of those kind of movies myself. And another possibility is to try and find the entrances where things are going in and out, and just bomb the entrances, and they can clear them, and you can bomb them, and they can clear them, and you can bomb them, and so forth. It's not ideal. And I do think that in the long run, if Iran really wanted to do this and were willing to build it underground, and they are, and they're building tunnels, they can do it. All we can do is delay it in the hopes that we get a regime that's a little less or much less hostile or more assuredly rational.
Do you have any thoughts on what happened in Syria? Did you know?
Again, we had David Albright here. He showed us the pictures and gave the narrative, and everything looked like a nuclear facility. This latest evidence where the IAEA has detected that there was uranium present, from the latest news reports I read, and it's only news reports, but it says that this uranium was not depleted uranium. And what that means is that it wasn't from Israeli munitions. So, and it wasn't, there's nobody's, and that it was processed in some way. So it wasn't just uranium ore that was in the ground. So that means somebody brought some processed uranium, and I think it was natural uranium. I think it was not enriched uranium. It was perfect for a weapons plutonium production reactor. Brought this to the facility. Why did they bring it to the facility well before startup? I don't know. I guess they hadn't learned that old lesson about not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Okay. We've reached the end of our time. Please join me in thanking Professor Gavin and Professor Cooperman for excellent comments.